for women of the Ivy League at that time, because the Ivy League was not open for women. And I got in. Why did I get in? Because I had Russian and French, and I had something else. I had a perfect history achievement test, an 800. So that got me into Mount Holyoke College, in spite of the fact that I didn't have the other prerequisites. I did not come from the right social circles, etc., etc. Anyway, also Mount Holyoke was hoping, like many other places, that I would study the Soviet system in Russia and become one of their professors of the Soviet history in some college, or join the American government, our government, and be, work for the government on the Soviet Union, be a Soviet specialist. I didn't do that. I studied China and Chinese. That was my thing. I wanted to know something that was different from my background, from what I knew. So that's where I went to. Anyway, after college, I wound up in Europe for a year. And this is a whole long story that will come out one day as a novel through another person. I wound up in high political and governmental circles. Anyway, what happened afterwards is, when I came back to the United States, as a result of that, I got my first position at the UN. It was a temporary summer position. I was the replacement for a librarian of what was called the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. Now, let me tell you, it was the hardest thing for a 21-year-old, because I saw reports coming in from Hiroshima and Nagasaki that would really get anyone who was 50 years old incredibly upset. But on the other hand, I was directly under the Secretary General's office, because that was a time when the Secretary General's office took care of that committee. I was on the 32nd floor, but I had access anytime I wanted to the 38th floor, which was the Secretary General's floor. And that was a time of Yutan, Secretary General Yutan. But another person was there on the 38th floor, very important person as far as we Americans are concerned, and that was Ralph Bunche. And I would like you to see a picture of Ralph Bunche as I'm talking about Ralph Bunche. He was an African American, the first African American to ever receive the Nobel Prize. And he did that for his work on the Palestinians and the Israelis. So Ralph Bunche was on the 38th floor. I didn't get to know him very well at all, but I got to wave at him and he got to wave at me. I was one of the young girls who went to the 38th floor. So that was my first UN experience. And that made me be the first person to be accepted to a new international program that was started at Fairleigh Dickinson University, which not very well-known university, but it was started by an incredible man called Nasrallah Fatemi, who had been Iran's representative to UNESCO in Paris. UNESCO is the United Nations Scientific, Educational, and Cultural Organization. While I was getting my master's there, I was asked by one of my professors, Ambassador Xenon Rositas of Cyprus, then the Dean of the UN Diplomatic Corps, to write some of his speeches. And I wrote his speeches for the 6th Committee of the UN. So you will not be surprised to know that I was hired by the UN in 1974, but not to do what I wanted to do. These were the 1970s, when things were much harder for women. And so I came in as a simultaneous interpreter. I think we can go back to other pictures now, because what happened is that I enjoyed that for quite a few years, for 5 years. I went to conference after conference in Europe, Asia, and Africa. For instance, I was in the first conference to deal with world conference dealing with world population, and that was in Bucharest in 1974. And for some reason, I wound up having lunches with one of the directors of the UNFPA, the United Nations Fund for Population Activities. His name was Jaap van Batten. And the lady, Mrs. Sadik, who later became the head of that organization. I also interpreted for UNCTAD 4. UNCTAD was the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. It held a gigantic meeting in Nairobi in 1976. And there, the Eastern European group, headed by the Soviets, obviously, asked me to come and be in private meetings with them and the developing countries. Now, let me tell you, the bosses didn't like this. I had to get permission. I told these people, please, if you want me to do that, you have to go and get permission. And the chief interpreter gave permission, reluctantly. So that was my kind of life in and out. I was in interpretation, but I often went outside of the ranks of normal interpreters. The other thing is I wound up being the neighbor of a fantastic man called Hikmat Nabulsi, who is the creator and head of the United Nations Volunteers. It's for young people and older people to come and volunteer into the UN. And I was living on the 6th floor of a house, and he was living on the 4th floor. And he had his friend, Eugene Ukel, who was a personnel director of the United Nations Development Program, come and stay in my apartment when I was away. And we can now go on to the next picture. How's that one? So, having gone through my books when I was away, Eugene declared that I was not in the right place as an interpreter. So I left interpretation. I was accepted and went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and then was brought into the United Nations Development Program's management training course, which, by the way, I have to tell you, was better than the Citibank training course. And I was subsequently sent to Africa. From there, I went to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in Rome, and later had a chance of a lifetime. And that's the person you're seeing now next to me in the photograph, working with Ambassador Paul-Marc Henry of France. He was the co-founder of the United Nations Development Program, together with Paul Hoffman. And some of you may remember that Paul Hoffman was the head of the Marshall Plan. So, however, even though I worked with Paul Marc, I also went on electoral missions to the UN, in Cambodia, in South Africa, and in Mozambique. And we can show pictures of me with those things. Go on. Yes, that was one of my favorite things, going through my province, Prey Vang in Cambodia. But when somebody doesn't know what the United Nations is, I usually start by telling them I was the chief of voter education for the United Nations Observer Mission in South Africa, the one that followed the election of Nelson Mandela, and point out that the European Union and the Commonwealth of Nations also voted that I be their chief of voter education. The love of my life, Pierre Ganem, whom I met because of Paul-Marc Henry, was the son of André Ganem, called l'éminence grise du Quai d'Orsay, in other words, the brains of the French Foreign Ministry. He was a member of the French delegation to San Francisco, where the UN Charter was put together. But more important was one of the key figures to put the charter of UNESCO together. UNESCO, again, is the educational scientific organization that is in Paris, France. Pierre's godfather was Henri Logis, the first French Undersecretary General, the one who headed part of the Secretariat, which with Eleanor Roosevelt as chair, put together the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Paul Marc, Ambassador Paul Marc-Henri, my mentor, was a mentee of both these men. You will not be surprised when you know that I love the UN, what I call the motley crew that tries its best for all of us, for humanity. An organization that accepted me, a nobody, a less than nobody, and let me be with some unbelievable people, witness incredible events, and play a minuscule part, and now I'm getting very emotional, a minuscule part in its unceasing efforts to lead humanity to an imperfect and real future. Now we could go to the next picture because that shows all of the motley crew as it was in Geneva, part of the motley crew in Geneva when we were all young. I thought that would be a nice thing to end with. Go back to the fervent dreams of youth. And hopefully they will still come about with a better planet for all of us. Now I'm ready for your questions.
So remember to unmute if you have questions. We also have another picture here of Francis Dubois, of course. Francis, you have a question.
Yeah, I have a question and a comment. Thank you very much, Tanya. I was also moved to hear so many important names in our life. And the golden rule is the mosaic, which is on the second floor of the United Nations, which was a gift from Thanksgiving Square, Dallas, Texas, to the US mission. And the US mission gave it for the 40th anniversary of the United Nations in '85. And we did the rededication in when they reopened the building. Anyhow, Tanya, thank you very much for the story of your life. Tell us, since you retired and since you work in Dallas, now you have become an author.
I've become a novelist. Actually, I have to tell all of you something. I've always been a novelist. When I was 10 years old, and you need to hear this, I know Francis always says, you know, that's not that important, but you need to hear this. When I was 10 years old and both my parents were poor immigrants working, the people in our building did not want me to play outside. This was the 1950s, they didn't want a little girl playing outside. So my parents used to lock me in the apartment when they went to work. And you can imagine I was locked in. Lockdown is nothing new for me. I was locked in from the time they went to work until they came back from work, all summer long, Christmas vacation, Easter vacation. And they did something wonderful. Not the first year, the second year when I was 10, they bought me an Olympic typewriter. So I had books and I had a typewriter. And I started my first novel. The title will make you laugh, Against Her Will, because I was locked up against my will, right? 200-page novel. I'm putting it together right now so that I can publish it next year because it's about a princess. Obviously, what was I, 10 years old? A Zorro-like princess, because any of you who are old enough will remember that Zorro ran in 1957. So when I did watch television in the evening, when my parents allowed me to watch television, I saw Zorro. So I created a princess that was like Zorro. And so I started, whenever I was anywhere, I would always have pieces of paper with me, and I always wrote. I wrote when I was 20. I wrote when I was 21. I wrote one book that is very hard for me to write, to go over, but which will come out one day. But I did write one when I was 21 about Mount Holyoke College, where I went, a novel. I created characters. None of them is me. And there are aspects of me in them, in one of them. But the novel is called Before They Cut the Ivy. It's out. You can get it. Because our system in America was very different in those days than it is today. It was different when the Ivy League and the Seven Sisters were a kind of socio-economic way of bringing an elite together. I have to be very honest to all of you guys. It's an elite being brought together. So I wrote about it. It was out in the fall, but that was not the first book. The first book that I got out was Choices, was about an American girl, a real American girl who comes from Long Island, not like me, and whose mother is from West Virginia. I always use places that I've been to, otherwise you don't understand what the place is like. So a girl whose mother is from West Virginia, and the town in Long Island is a town I've known because of a professor. So I used that and created Choices, an American girl in Africa in the 1980s. And I think Joan has read that book, right?
Not working on it.
Working on it, okay. Then after that, I wrote a book called Mangoes and Blood. By the way, Before They Cut the Ivy was written actually in the early 70s. Choices was written about 1988, 1989. Mangoes and Blood was written in the late 70s. And it is a hostage situation with very different hostage takers. If those of you who are old enough will remember, 70s were full of hostage situations. And I saw a room in Nairobi at that time that seemed to have only one entrance and exit. And I said, oh, they're going to have a big reception here. Oh, it frightened me. I still went to the reception, nothing happened. But it was a perfect situation for a hostage situation with high-level people. So I created it in a novel with very different hostage takers. And then my last book for the time being, 2 volumes, is A Question of Seduction, Eros and Agape. And that is because I looked at the various aspects of love. International again. By the way, the hero of A Question of Seduction, Kareem, is an Arab Muslim from the Gulf. I thought it was time to have an Arab Muslim man or woman, but I created the man in this case, who was a hero. So those are my books, and that was written by me in 1990, 1991. And it was Pierre, my love of my life, Pierre Ganem, who actually typed it into the computer. So there you have my books. Questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, Pat, hi.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. It was such an interesting presentation where you've had so much varied experience at the United Nations. And I was very glad to see that you highlighted Ralph Bunche, who has done so much for the UN, and Undersecretary General Kerr recently highlighted him as well in one of his town hall meetings. So that was great. I was also very glad to hear that you thought the UN management training course was better than the one at Citibank, since I worked in UN training for a long time. But my question is, it's very interesting to me that you became a fiction writer, and because of all your experience at the UN, I wondered if you had any sort of, conflict about whether you would write about all the results of all your experiences in a fiction form or a nonfiction form, and why you chose the fiction form.
Well, one of the reasons I chose the fiction form is that I started so early with a novel. I mean, you have to understand that. And also because you can use different voices. If it is only my voice and my story, it's my voice. This way I can use the voices of so many people I have known in my life. This is not my voice. This is the voice of all that motley crew. How's that?
Yeah.
I wanted
Perfect.
the motley crew in there, not me.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much.
Tatiana, I'm fascinated by your experience at the UN and your heartfelt sense that there were so many people there really trying to make the world a better place. And oftentimes the UN is really disparaged for being cynical or, being a place just to absorb money and not see any return. And I'm wondering why there is that image, and maybe you have a comment on what you can say about the image versus the reality or something.
Well, that's in fact one of the reasons that I wrote these books, because I wanted people to know the reality. That's why I called it the motley, always refer to the motley crew. I think people always see UN political, they see, especially in the United States, what we see very often is the UN Secretariat, the Secretary General, all those very important people. I wanted to talk about the people who were not important, the people who actually worked for the UN, the people who went in the field, the people who walked amid the mines. I mean, I've had colleagues, I have a colleague, not very close, but who died trying to demine a place. So that is very important for me. These are real people. They're not the ones who go from, from one reception to another. These are the people who really work. These are the people who have normal lives. They, they have families, they have loves, they have children, they have sicknesses, they die. And we have on television in America, think about it, we have heroes who are doctors, we have heroes who are lawyers, we have heroes who are policemen, have heroes who are military people. You know what? We've never had heroes or heroines who are UN people, and we deserve to have heroes and heroines who are UN people. So read my books. You have lots of heroes and heroines in there. They're all based on real people. They're put together from reality. I mean, in Choices, one of my best heroes is a sweeper. A sweeper. That's what he is. But he keeps the office together.
That's fantastic.
Other questions? Don't be scared. You can ask me all kinds of questions.
I have one.
Yes,
Hello.
Nina.
Hello. Thank you, Tatiana, for your presentation. If someone were to make a film about your life, which scenes would be in it that show how you made a difference to make the world a better place?
I would probably do it in Cambodia, because in Cambodia, it's why I became the head of voter education in South Africa. In Cambodia, I went to the field. Remember, you saw that picture of me with about 3,000 women? You saw the picture? I went everywhere. I took quotes unquote chances. I really went. And I know Francis has done that in his life. We just take chances. We go to reach out people. And what happened in Cambodia is that two places. It happened in Cambodia and in Mozambique. In Cambodia, we had provinces did not want to accept the results of the elections. But in my province, I was the deputy head of elections in my province. I was not the head. The local people, the local military, the local government went with me as I went out. They did not kick me out. We were basically kicked out of 3 provinces. They did not kick me out. They accompanied me. Why? Because I made a difference.
Right.
That's when you're ready to sacrifice, you can do that. And in Mozambique, I was in a province which was a key province, because instead of being Renamo or Frelimo, these were the 2 parties. Instead of being Renamo, Frelimo, you know, north-south, it was one village, one city divided among against the other. And what I did is I organized a peace run, and everybody ran for prizes in peace. And when it came to the elections itself, the Renamo would not accept the results of the election. And the head of Renamo in my province went on television and said, we accept the elections because they were well done in our province. And that was a wonderful thing for me. I mean, that makes your day, that makes your life, that makes it possible for you to write novels, because you feel that whatever you have done, whatever chances you have taken are worth it. I was in front of Kalashnikovs. I know Francis has also had the same experiences. We know what these things are, but we laugh at them. And we want people to understand that they exist. We're not just people who go into receptions. That's what people see us around a table. That's not what the UN is. The UN is people on the ground, people working every day in the computer in their little offices. That's the people who should be known and seen by everybody in the United States.
Thank you.
Thank you for a lovely presentation. Absolutely wonderful. Quick question. How did you happen to choose Texas at this point?
Well, I chose, what happened is the love of my life, Pierre, died of an aneurysm at the age of 50.
Wow.
And I was kind of at a loss at what to do. And one of my friends, who was a lawyer in Dallas, said, there's the Thanksgiving Foundation. And the Thanksgiving Foundation is basically the only organization in Texas, which is also a non-governmental organization with the United Nations. Now, you know, it used to be known as DPI, Department of Public Information, but now it's Civil Society Unit and Global Communications. But because it was still linked with the United Nations, and because it talked about a value, I think values are our common denominators. I think that it is through values that we get to understand each other, because we all value certain things. We value our families, we value our friends, we value a way of living, with a peaceful way of living, or resolving things. And that is why I came to Texas. And because Thanksgiving Foundation is the one that gave, guess what? That wonderful mosaic to the United Nations. So,
The Golden Rule.
and all of you should go visit it. Francis will take you there when it's open. You should all go and visit it and tell your friends, because the United States gave that. And if you think about it, it was not publicized enough. I've always wanted that to be publicized, that the way we treat each other, the embodiment of it in a picture. Remember, a picture is worth 1,000 words, was given by the Thanksgiving Foundation in Dallas, Texas.
Tatiana, I've been to the Thanksgiving, I guess, what is the Thanksgiving Foundation Monument in Dallas? I'm not sure.
Giving Square, Douglas?
Yeah, exactly. And maybe you could describe it a little bit. It's a very unusual spot, and tell us what the Thanksgiving Foundation does. I happened to walk upon it. It's a very, it's kind of a work of art and a building in the middle of the city.
All right.
I'd like to hear your description. And
well, I was its president from 2002 to 2010, and I was its senior advisor until 2014, and I'm still representing the Thanksgiving Foundation at the UN. So let me tell you what it is. It is a spiral chapel that was designed by Philip Johnson. And the spiral chapel is actually based on a monument in Iraq. It is based on a place of worship in Iraq built in the 9th century. And it's really spirals. It's a spiraling. The spiraling is our way of getting to a higher place, our way of thinking about others, our way of getting away from the earth without leaving the earth, which is very, very important. And it has trees around it. Everything in Thanksgiving Square is symbolic. And it is dedicated to American and world Thanksgiving. It was founded by a man called Peter Stewart, who was a World War II veteran who came in on the 6th or the 7th day of the invasion in Normandy, who cared about people getting together. Can you imagine he had this done in Dallas in the 1970s? It was built, but he thought of an idea in 1961. Everyone says it's because of the Kennedy assassination. No, it came much earlier. Peter was one of these rare people that we have on this planet who always thinks of bringing all of us together with values. So that's Thanksgiving Square. If you're ever in Dallas, you have to come, because Thanksgiving Square sometimes feels that it is left out and not looked at. Come and go and to www.thanksgiving.org and you'll see what Thanksgiving Square is and what it is.
As a visitor, I thank you. It is a really beautiful place. Thank you for that.
Any other questions?
Okay, one last question. Can you tell us a little about your work in South Africa and the election? Was it 1989?
No, remember, it was 1994, the elections in South Africa for Mandela. Well, what we did was, for there we were just an observer mission, but we went and we observed how they were teaching people to vote. Remember, I was in voter education, so I went to different places and saw whether people were being taught what is it to vote. Because you have to understand, there's a very big difference between saying to go and vote, right? And teaching people what is it really to vote. I have never used the word vote. I've always used the word choice. I learned that in Cambodia, because if you said to people to vote, it really didn't mean that. I said to them, you have limited things, and I always kept that. And you have to choose between what you want. Do you want a road? Do you want a school? Do you want to set up some kind of a factory to do something? Because you cannot do all things. I think one of the greatest things that we misunderstand about voting is the fact that it is making a choice, and we cannot choose everything. We have to be discerning. We have to decide what is important for us. So that's what I basically did in South Africa. I went to different places, saw how they had set up things. I saw how they set up booths. I also talked to the people. I listened to what was said on television. I was on television. I did all these things. And I mean, I traveled the country from north to south, from east to west, and that just to make Francis, who knows these things, laugh a little bit. I remember one day getting out of Johannesburg in a little car by myself, going to Durban, and on the way hearing, whoop, a bomb went off right next to the UN office. And then I left Durban, going back to Johannesburg. A bomb went off in Durban. You know, you've got to understand that people in the UN really care. They wouldn't be there. We wouldn't be there if we did not care. And that's what I want everybody to understand. Francis, he has a question or a comment.
Yeah, I have a comment. I want to thank you once again. Since we are celebrating this year the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, I think it was wonderfully appropriate, Tanya, for you to give us your life story and to celebrate this organization. So I would like to make a commitment. Once this pandemic is over and then we can travel to UN headquarters, I would suggest to our dear President John that we'll all celebrate the United Nations at the UN, and we'll have lunch at the delegates' dining room to celebrate this anniversary with the Paris American Club.
Francis, it's a wonderful idea. We certainly embrace it. We can't wait.